Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the crash of Pakistan International Airlines Flight 661. And look, this isn't just your standard story about a plane going down. It is a forensic mystery. We're going to see how tiny, completely hidden flaws can align perfectly in the sky to create an unimaginable catastrophe. On December 7, 2016, an ATR 42-500 aircraft took off on what really should have been just another routine flight. But instead, it turned into an absolute battle, a battle between highly experienced pilots and a machine that suddenly and terrifyingly decided to defy the very laws of aerodynamics it was built on. To really grasp the gravity of this event, we kind of have to put ourselves right there in that cockpit. As one observer on a forensic engineering forum bluntly put it, it's the sheer helplessness of the situation that just haunts you. You have to remember, the pilots of Flight 661, they were not novices. Captain Saleh Janjua had over 12,000 hours of flight experience. He was actually an instructor on this exact type of aircraft. But as we're going to see, absolutely no amount of training could have prepared them for the unprecedented mechanical nightmare that was about to unfold. They were ultimately trapped in a situation where their own aircraft effectively turned against them.
The route from Chitral to Islamabad is breathtaking. It weaves right through the remote, mountainous valleys of northern Pakistan. But when you think about this geography, you realize just how unforgiving it is. You're flying at around 13,500 feet, and you are entirely surrounded by these towering, jagged peaks. In this kind of environment, altitude is literally your only safety net. If you lose an engine and start to descend, well, you don't have the luxury of flat, open plains to glide over. You're instantly thrust into a high-stakes, life-or-death fight just to maintain enough altitude to clear the rock faces looming right in front of you.
Now, before we get into what went wrong, we need to understand a vital aviation survival mechanic. It's called feathering. Think about it like this. We've all been driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour and stuck our hand out the window, right? If your palm is facing forward, catching the wind, it pushes your hand back violently. That's drag. But if you turn your hand completely flat, slicing through the air like a blade, all that resistance just vanishes. That is exactly what feathering a propeller does. When an engine fails, the pilot commands the propeller blades to turn edge on to the wind. This stops the dead engine from acting like a giant air brake, which lets the plane fly safely on its one remaining good engine.
In a standard single-engine failure, the propeller feathers, the drag drops, and the pilots simply fly to the nearest airport. No big deal. But on Flight 661, the left engine didn't just fail. The propeller completely refused to feather. Instead, it locked into a flat pitch, facing the oncoming air head-on. This generated a massive 2,000 pounds of drag force. To put that into perspective for a second, that is 7 times more drag than a normal feathered propeller. It was the aerodynamic equivalent of throwing an invisible 2,000-pound anchor out of the left side of the aircraft while traveling at hundreds of miles an hour.
Part 1, the mechanical nightmare, 3 latent flaws.
So how exactly does a modern aircraft suffer such a catastrophic, physics-defying failure? Well, it wasn't just one thing breaking. It was this dark alignment of 3 pre-existing, totally hidden technical anomalies, all just waiting for the exact moment to strike together. It's like a falling house of cards. First up, a single blade on the power turbine, the PT-1 blade, fractured. This threw the engine's internal rotation completely out of balance, creating severe vibrations. Those vibrations then damaged a bearing seal, which allowed microscopic pieces of metal to leak straight into the engine oil. But wait, that wasn't all. Inside the propeller's overspeed governor, which is the device meant to prevent the propeller from spinning dangerously fast, a tiny rotational pin was already broken. And finally, some sort of external contamination somehow found its way into the propeller valve module. 3 separate issues. On their own, they might just cause a routine engine shutdown. But together, they formed a lethal, unstoppable cascade.
Because that tiny rotational pin was broken, the internal valve started spinning in a way it was absolutely never designed to. Then, that metallic oil contamination flowed into the governor, acting like liquid sandpaper. It jammed the mechanisms completely. The governor basically lost its mind. It started commanding the propeller's pitch independently, fighting against the airplane's electronic controls, and entirely overriding the pilot's desperate inputs. We're talking about 9 agonizing minutes of terror in the cockpit, kicking off at 11:04 UTC. The pilots received a master warning. The left engine lost power, so they initiated the standard checklist to feather the propeller, exactly as they were trained to do. But because of those 3 compounded flaws we just talked about, the system ignored them. The propeller's speed began wildly fluctuating. It dropped on to 62%, shot back up, and then went completely unrecorded by the data sensors. The pilots were essentially flying blind against a machine that was dynamically changing its own aerodynamic shape, second by second.
Then came Phase 4, the uncommanded surge. Between 11:11 and 11:12, the left propeller speed violently shot up to over 120% of its normal capacity. Just imagine the deafening roar inside that cabin. The blades moved into a low pitch, catching the wind aggressively. The massive drag on the left side required the pilots to use immense physical force on the rudder pedals just to keep the plane flying straight. The aircraft was bleeding speed rapidly, slowing down towards a highly dangerous stall state, while the pilots frantically tried to make sense of a situation that quite literally existed in no training manual on Earth. And then, the physics just snapped. At around 11:12, the left propeller suddenly stopped spinning entirely. That massive 2,000-pound drag force, it vanished in a split second. Because the pilots were pushing so incredibly hard on the right rudder to fight the drag, this sudden release acted like a slingshot. The aircraft violently yawed, lost all lift, and entered an uncontrolled stall. The plane physically rolled over, completely upside down, completing a full 360-degree barrel roll. In a matter of seconds, they plummeted 5,100 feet right out of the sky. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sounds of extreme panic, the stall alarms blaring, and the terrifying realization of their freefall. Now, miraculously, in a display of sheer piloting skill and heroic desperation, Captain Janjua and his first officer actually managed to recover the aircraft from the inverted roll. They pulled out of the dive at around 8,300 feet. But it was a doomed victory. The propeller had locked into a final degraded state. The drag was still immense. Advanced operational analysis of the crash proved that in this specific state, level flight was mathematically impossible. They were trapped in a continuous, inescapable descent into the mountains, fighting a doomed battle all the way to the ground. At approximately 11:20 UTC, the aircraft impacted the mountainous terrain near Havelian. All 47 souls on board were lost. This included not just the highly skilled flight crew, but families, the Deputy Commissioner of Chitral Usama Waraish, and the renowned Pakistani pop icon turned preacher Junaid Jamshed. It was a profound, heartbreaking tragedy that shook the nation and demanded uncompromising answers. Part 2. A fatal maintenance omission. So how did those 3 latent flaws end up in that engine in the first place? To answer that, we have to shift our focus away from the frantic helplessness of the cockpit and look at the sterile, brightly lit floors of the maintenance hangars. Because what the investigation uncovered wasn't some unavoidable act of God, it was a grim, entirely preventable omission. You see, the manufacturer actually knew about the fragile PT-1 blades. 6 months before the crash, they issued a mandatory service bulletin requiring airlines to replace these blades the moment they hit 10,000 hours of flight time. Just 26 days before the crash, Flight 661's left engine was in the PIA maintenance shop for a totally unrelated issue. The engine was physically open. The maintenance log clearly showed the blades had exactly 10,004.1 hours on them. They had crossed the threshold. The requirement was crystal clear. Yet, PIA's engineering team skipped the replacement, closed the engine up, and cleared it for flight. And this wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was highly indicative of a deeper systemic rot. The final investigation report, which, by the way, aviation experts note is a rare and highly rigorous crash probe for Pakistan, highlighted massive institutional failures. PIA had a documented history of incredibly poor engine reliability compared to the global fleet. The airline was habitually non-compliant with vital manufacturer bulletins. And perhaps worse of all, the Civil Aviation Authority of Pakistan, the very body meant to police the airlines, was found to have completely inadequate oversight. They consistently failed to catch these blatant safety violations during their audits. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this explainer. The pilots did absolutely everything humanly possible, fighting a monstrous aerodynamic anomaly born from invisible, fractured metal. But that metal fractured because someone on the ground decided a manual entry wasn't important enough to follow. So I leave you with this. When a single neglected line in a maintenance manual can literally turn a routine flight into a 2,000-pound invisible wall in the sky, what is the true ultimate cost of cutting corners? Thank you so much for exploring this with me. Take care and stay curious.